Welcome to Stillwater, Minnesota. This is one of the oldest cities in the state of Minnesota and my hometown. We're here because this week on Past and Presents, we're talking about the relationship between history and biography. So you'll be joining me as we take a kind of walking tour of some of my favorite places in Stillwater, Minnesota. Stillwater is nestled in the St. Croix River Valley, just about half an hour east of the Twin Cities. So we're up the hill a little bit, so you can get a shot of the river and a little bit of the downtown. We'll go down there by the river later on in the webisode. I'm actually standing in front of a fairly new part of Stillwater. This is the War and Veterans Memorial, kind of interesting conical structure that was put up just a few years ago. I'm actually looking, though, off to my left at an older memorial. The Civil War Memorial is by the flagpole of the historic Washington County Courthouse. The actual courthouse is moved into Oak Park Heights, just up the hill a bit more. This is the old one, which is used now mostly for wedding receptions, actually. So we are talking about the relationship between history and biography, and so I'll share a little bit of my autobiography as we go to some spots around Stillwater, which is where I lived from 7th grade until graduating high school. But we're also going to talk about this in a couple of other fields. We're going to hear from Amy Poppinga in the first part of our conversation about whether biography is a kind of history and the use of biographies as sources by historians. So this week, our conversation in Past and Presents, I'm joined by just one of my colleagues, Amy Poppinga. We've already seen before. This time it's just Mono.
Yes,
Poppinga.
Indeed.
If you brought your A game.
I did.
So I'll be asking questions, but also acting a little bit more as one of our panelists as we talk about the relationship between history and biography. Are those two discrete categories? Is biography a type of history or vice versa? And maybe a starting point here is, I'll actually go to our second question. On Amazon the other day, I was looking at the best of or most popular history list, and it's hard not to notice that at least half of the books on there are actually biographies. So let me start here. What's the best biography you've ever read, and what made it so compelling?
Sure. I like biography a lot, and I feel like I always have. I mean, even since I was a kid, reading like children's biographies that are geared specifically towards children. But probably my favorite biography of late in the last 3 years is a book called Nothing Daunted by Dorothy Wickenden, who is an editor for the New York Times, I think. And so anyway, this biography is of her grandmother and her grandmother's good friend, who both leave. They're both from relatively wealthy families in upstate New York, and they decide they finish college and they are not married, and that was sort of unusual at the time. They didn't kind of have, especially coming from these wealthy families, marriage prospects, and so they decided to go be teachers in Colorado. And so they travel by train, and they keep detailed, elaborate journals. And so this biography is geared on her grandmother, but then also this friend's experiences, but it's all, it interweaves and uses all of the journals and the letters that these women would write back home to family. And then as each of them, one of them stays in Colorado, so to each other. And that kind of launched for me. I've always been interested. I'm from the Southwest, and I've always sort of been interested in the history of the frontier. My family's own history with that, but that book sort of, even though it's a little bit later, because these women were out in Colorado in 1916 to 1920, and it's also fascinating because you sense that, you know, their knowledge of impending war and the United States sort of, as the United States is sort of pulled into war, and that's really fascinating. But it sort of then, that led to me finding other sort of frontier diaries, pioneer diaries, if you will, diaries that dealt with women who were homesteading in New Mexico, and then there's more in Arizona, so I've read more about women homesteading in Arizona. But I think that especially for if you're interested in women's experiences and women's history, journals and diaries are such an important tool, and so I've been more drawn to biographies that revolve around using those to kind of frame the rest of the text.
Sure.
So,
I think on one level biographies are very inviting, right?
Yeah.
There's a character whose story you can enter into. It might be someone you identify with. It might also be someone whose experience is completely different. To go back to a conversation we've had before about the usable versus foreign past, one of my favorite biographies is by Carlo Ginzburg, an Italian historian, called The Cheese and the Worms. And it's just a deeply weird book. It's about an Italian in the late 6th century named Domenico Scandella, living through the kind of aftershock of the Catholic Reformation. And he has this very interesting worldview. And so it's Ginsburg essentially is reconstructing the way this one guy thought about the origins of the world. He has his own kind of cosmology or mythology, and it's influenced by the Bible and by the Quran and by the Decameron, and ends up being tried by the Roman Inquisition, which is our major source for his life, is they ask him all these questions about where you came from and what shaped your views about the world. But Ginsburg writes that he's not trying to do the typical biography. I mean, he doesn't want it, the story of the kings, the people who are the most powerful. Instead, he's saying, could we ever resurrect the life of someone from, he calls it the subordinate classes?
Yes.
I think that might be why women's biographies are really interesting.
Absolutely. And for me, in my own just sort of, I actually think it's both. It's whether it's in my personal reading or whether it's things that I would choose to use for class. I've always been fascinated by just the day-to-day. And I'm that way when I travel. I always think, okay, well, we see where really wealthy people lived and important people lived, but like, who lives behind these doors and windows that we pass on the way to actually getting to the things that are on the tour? And that's what I really like the biography of, just, I mean, like these two women who go and teach, and it's just about this particular experience that they have, and they don't end up doing anything, quote, great that they're going to be remembered by history for. But I love biography because it gets you into the details of day-to-day living, and what people ate and how people lived, and I think that is something that is really important that can be overlooked. So
I think I'm hearing us both say we like this quite a bit.
Yes,
and maybe in our second segment we'll talk about teaching with it or research. But I mean, to play devil's advocate, couldn't you argue that you can put too much emphasis on one life? I mean, there's a kind of economy of doing the work of history. Maybe you just use the phrase opportunity cost before we started filming. If you focus a whole project on one or two people's lives, I mean, that's leaving out thousands you could have been researching instead. I mean, what does it look like to put too much emphasis? I mean, could biography actually overwhelm history at a certain point?
I absolutely think that it can. That there's the danger of that. In my own research work, because I do a lot of work with oral history and individual interviews, something that one of the authors I like, he's an Islamic studies professor named Kambiz Ganea Basiri, and he talks about the fact that too much emphasis on individual experience can be troubling because individual experience doesn't necessarily reshape communal norms, and it doesn't necessarily reflect communal norms. So I've found that in my own work, I do have to be very careful in making sure that the person I'm focusing on and that their story I'm not presenting it in such a way that I'm making an argument that it's representative of that person's entire community, or again that it somehow has had some sort of reshaping power, because it may not. And I think that is something that I've seen happen, where we have really popular biographies and they're really powerful and they really draw people in. So then sort of a revisionist history starts to happen around that person's particular story, and that person's story becomes the norm for that experience. There's a book by an autobiography by Ayaan Hirsi Ali called Infidel, which is about her experience as a Somali woman who grows up in Somalia, and her challenges with Islam, and her challenges with that once she becomes a refugee in Europe. And it's a very powerful book. At the same time, I have seen where it has also done quite a bit of, I think the word damage may be too strong, but it has become so popular that it has sort of become the norm for how do we talk about Muslim women's experiences. And I think that's really frustrating, not just for me as somebody who teaches in the discipline of Islamic studies, but it's frustrating for other individual Muslims who are saying that isn't my experience at all. So
on the flip side, the nice thing about biographies, and so I think there's a balance to strike here, is, I mean, there are ways of doing history that are very deterministic, and it's all sweeping forces, and it can flatten individual experiences and leave out particularity. So I think that's a challenge, but at the same time, it is sometimes nice to have someone emerge from that who maybe doesn't quite fit theories and patterns and challenges preconceptions. we've heard this from our friend from Sam Mulbray, I think comes from Frederick Buechner, that memoirs, autobiographies, maybe biographies can serve as distant mirrors to us. They hold up in some extent, maybe we see ourselves. It has a kind of individual sort of purpose. It shapes our own reflection, but maybe it also is a kind of mirror on a community's experience. And it's not a perfect reflection.
No,
but
right.
You see
but
similarities and differences.
It doesn't mean it doesn't have value. I mean, there is no perfect, right? And so I think about how my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, who passed away 9 years ago, he, in the last few years of his life, started to write his memoirs. And so it was funny because I came across them the other day when I was cleaning out a box in our basement, and I had read through this, and it's probably the equivalent of, I don't know, probably 85 pages or something. And so I'm reading through it, and I remember that when my family initially read this, we kind of had a good laugh because there were certain things my grandfather said about my dad that just kind of weren't true. Like he made a comment that none of his children ever smoked or drank a day in their life. Not true. We all had a good laugh about that. At the same time, what was fascinating to me was that the other things that my grandfather said about the character of my father and his respect for other people, and that respect regardless of another person's station, calling everyone sir and ma'am, and his kindness and his humility, I thought my grandfather perfectly captured those things. So, I mean, on the one hand, certain memories are revisionist history, and we all have a good laugh about it, but yet at the same time, these characteristics of who my father is, I felt were perfectly represented, and they were things I hadn't even sort of consciously recognized until I was reading that and thought, yeah, that's exactly, who my father is. So I see the value in, I see the value regardless of the fact that it may not all be perfect.
I think of pre-law as an advising program. There's no pre-law major. So our pre-law program consists of talking with students who are interested in going into law. One of the first things we want to do is assess whether or not law school is for them. It's not for everyone. It's really expensive. Law schools kind of tight these days in terms of the number of students they're admitting. So we want to assess that. I want to talk about the motivation that students have for going into law. There are lots of different types of careers in law, so we want to connect with students about that as well. So that's the first step in the advising process, but then there are other things as well, like what courses to take at Bethel. And then when it comes time, how to prepare for applying to law school. We'll talk about the LSAT, the test that students have to take. We can also talk with students about interning with alums who are lawyers. It's a good way to get a sense of what a legal career is like. Sometimes a paralegal career is a better option for students as well, so we want to talk about that with them. Law schools are generally looking for a good liberal arts education, good background, and a history degree, a political science degree, an English degree. Those are fine degrees. But even beyond that, we would encourage students to take courses in the liberal arts. So if you major in history, take courses in economics, take courses in sociology, whatever interests you. That'll be attractive, I think, to a law school. So we try to help students in the advising process through that. But generally, a good liberal arts education, writing skills, good communication skills, those are the things that we're looking for.
We'll come back to our conversation about biography and history later in the webisode, but let me tell you a little bit of my own biography. My family moved to Stillwater in 1987. I was about to turn 12 years old. The Twins had just won the World Series, but more exciting to me, because I was that nerdy, we had this library to go to. The first Stillwater library is probably from around the 1890s. This building went up in 1902, and you might notice that it's called a Carnegie Library. You probably know that Andrew Carnegie was a famous Scottish immigrant, pulled himself up by his own bootstraps to become the incredibly wealthy industrialist and magnate of U.S. Steel, and then gave away much of his wealth for a variety of causes, but probably most famously to start libraries as a kind of self-help device. This is one of 65 Carnegie libraries in the state of Minnesota. There are about 1,700 in the United States, and altogether around the world there are about 2,500 Carnegie libraries. I just can't tell you how important libraries were in my development as someone who wanted to be a teacher and who just loved to learn about history, and at least when I was 12, things like baseball and poker. But we won't get into that anymore. There's only so much biography to tell.
I am a Bethel graduate, 1988.
I'm a 1999 Bethel grad.
I'm a teacher at Minnehaha Academy.
I am the pastor of worship and adult ministries here at Church of the Cross.
Mutuality editor and publications coordinator.
I work as an attorney in the business and corporate practice.
English Language Institute, China, in China.
Library director at the College of St. Scholastica.
I'm a history professor at Bethel University.
I was a history major.
I was a Bethel history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
History major.
I was a history major.
I was a history major.
I'm Tony Barthel. I'm a 1999 Bethel grad, a history major, and a political science major, so I was a double major. I work as an attorney in the business and corporate practice at Howell & Habak in Minneapolis. Going into being a history major, I didn't really know what to expect other than I really liked to study it. And so I was a business major for my first semester, and I took business calculus, and I knew that just wasn't fulfilling for me. And so I sat down with Neil Lettinga, and he pulled out the list of the 105 things you can do with a history major. And I just thought, well, there's still choices, and so I might as well study something that I enjoy. And so I did. And I knew right away, once I started those classes, that I enjoyed every minute of it. I enjoyed the material. I enjoyed the professors. And I'd have to say that what sealed it was we had a World War I class during interim, and I just so thoroughly enjoyed it. And I saw people from outside the major enjoying it, and I thought, I'm really lucky that every day this is my experience as a history major. I get to do this all the time. And that's when I knew that that was a lot of fun for me. I was a TA for Ruben Rivera and also Diana Magnuson. And so I had Ruben Rivera his first year. One of the projects that I worked on was we were looking for rare books for his collection to do some works for his dissertation. And so I perused all of the used bookshops around town, made phone calls, and tried to source materials. So that was a lot of fun. And then I worked with Diana Magnuson for 1 year, and one of my jobs there was getting the archives started over at the seminary. And so I walked into a room that just had books and pictures and everything you can possibly imagine that was just stuffed in the corner, and start sorting through and trying to bring some organization to it. And so it was a lot of fun because it was opening boxes of, well, what's in here? And so I had to kind of try to guess by decade and start sorting through it that way. So that was a fun project. I enjoyed it, and it was a little bit unique TA experience, I think. Well, I was a poli-sci minor, and at first. So really, for lack of anything else other than G.W. Carlson was around, and it was either a history course or a poli-sci course, and they were all interested in me, so I just kept taking those courses. And I finished a semester out in Washington, D.C., and came back and realized I'm within 3 credits of having a political science major. And so then, kind of as an afterthought, we developed a kind of a way through to get the major. So I had to double up on a couple things in my senior year, but I was able to get that too. So at first I was a history major and a poli-sci major by happenstance, but they were both fantastic, and they both spoke to each other very well. I think it's an invaluable experience. I would suggest anyone that has the opportunity to be able to go away for a semester do that, particularly when you're a Bethel student. You get used to a rhythm and a routine, and it's very comfortable. And it's not so much that I want someone to become uncomfortable, but there is another perspective. And I remember coming back very disillusioned, which wasn't a bad thing. It was an exposure to something that was bigger than what I had experienced up to that point. And so I had to develop the skill of reintegrating into something that was different. I enjoyed my time at American Studies program. It was a lot of fun. Got to meet some great kids from across the country, from different CCCU colleges and universities, and had people come visit from school, so that was fantastic. And then got to go to practically every building in the city. In fact, I even got to go in the Oval Office one night for dinner, which was not a planned event, it just kind of happened. And so in the State Building, Supreme Court, just to see where some of this was going on, and being a poli-sci and a history person, it was a constant field trip. There was always something going on, or was recognizing someone down the street, and it made that which was theoretical and that which was somewhat abstract to something very real, and you saw how everything worked together. And so for me, it kind of gelled what was going on into there's something that is going on here. And some of the skill sets started to show up too. Part of it was pulling together massive amounts of information, developing themes, reading through materials, finding things that don't fit, and kind of letting that part of the research die. So from a research perspective, that program was invaluable for me, and I really enjoyed it. So when I went to DC and was able to observe the town in general, it's pretty hard to notice that most everyone has some legal training in various offices. So there's lots of people that don't, but every office is touched by lawyers in some way. And I saw that and I detested it. I didn't want it. I was very disillusioned with the idea that somehow this fight was always going on and there was conflict. And for me, that conflict was something I wasn't used to experiencing. And the fight and the competition for ideas was very real. And so that embodied, that lawyerly approach embodied that competition that I didn't want to embrace. And so when I came back, I knew for sure, 100%, I would never be a lawyer, ever. But I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. And really lost in some way. I knew that I had some capabilities. I could read, I could write, I could do some research, I could facilitate meetings with people, but I didn't have a place. And one of the things I looked at was going to Cornell University in New York to be a city planner. And so I started studying for the GRE and all sorts of other things, and came to the conclusion that that just wasn't really me. It was just trying to fill something. And so it was really a hard transition for me out of school. I didn't really have a lot of direction. But I did have one friend that had gone to the University of Minnesota Law School for a year. And so I decided that I would not let lawyer jokes keep me from at least looking at it. And so I talked to her about it. And when I started hearing about the experience and what you do as a law student, I thought that that sounded like what I was made to do. And so I looked into it. And some of those things were reading. I loved to read. I could just devour a book. Part of it was presenting a case, finding some things that fit, things that don't fit. So some of the reasoning that goes on in that process. And the cause effect of things, also out of a history major. You know, this happened and this caused this, and it's natural. This is what we would try to do because of what happened. And so I thought that was a very natural fit for me to check out. And so when I got to law school, what I found out was there's a lot of really smart kids. And it was really, not imposing, but it was weighty, I guess, in some way, where everyone was from different backgrounds, not all history majors, but there were plenty of them, but they were also all pretty much supercharged. And so that was unique, and that was the part that I had a really hard time with, was the hyper-competitiveness of the situation. And then so what I had to do was I had to say, you know, I'm not going to compete with these people, I'm going to compete with myself. And that really, for me, was the change. And I looked at my skills and ability and what I like to do, and it no longer became what other people expected me to do or how I fit into someone else's system, but what was I naturally gifted at. And so when I looked at the history major, and then what also lawyers do, there's a host of things that we do as lawyers that tend to attract people from English majors, poli-sci majors, history majors, and you do get business and finance folks. But one of the legs up, I think, particularly early on as a student, is you can devour massive amounts of information. And that's really what it turned into, was who can sit in the chair the longest and get through the most material and remember some of it. And so it was never a memorization. It was taking information in and try to develop themes. And so that's another thing that showed up in the history major, was what are the themes? Why did something happen? What's the cause and effect? What seems to be natural? What is a person's normal response to something based on the situation? And so for me, that was really powerful to be able to show up with that skill set and start sorting through relationships, characters, you know, who the parties are, and what should probably happen, and then how did it get diverted a bit. So that was good for me. I think also the same thing goes for young lawyers. You walk in and you've been to law school for 3 years and you don't know anything. Literally, you would think that you'd show up and you're newly minted and you can do all these great things, and you show up and realize that you don't know where to get anything, you don't know where to find anything. And so it's kind of the process of finding research again and finding resources, and how can you shorten the cycle to get down to the white hot center of the issue as fast as possible. In law school, you had as much time as you could stay awake for. And when you got into practice, it was, well, how much will clients pay you for? And so you only had so much time to get it done. So finding some of those research skills really came back well for me, because senior STEM's a perfect example. You have to write a thematic paper. How do you go through all the materials and sort through what your theme is? How do you support it? We have to do that in law every day. What supports it? Where do I get that? And then also all the relationships that go into understanding which parties belong where. So I think there's a contextual advantage that you get from that major that really is helpful, particularly early on as an associate, because like we were discussing before, learning how to learning how to learn something you don't know is really one of the hallmarks of lawyers. We don't walk out the door and know how to do really anything. But what we do learn how to do is go solve problems, and that's what we spend our time doing. And so if it was easy, the person would probably go solve the problem for themselves, but what we bring is a different skill set to solve problems. So number one for me, which is it's non-academic, was I spent a lot of times in my studies. I probably would not spend as much time in my studies, and I would have focused more on relationships. It's not that I didn't have them, I did. It's, when it was Friday night at 11 o'clock, I might still be studying, and my friends were probably doing something fun. So, and that's more effective once you're outside of school. And so that was, I wouldn't say a struggle for me, but it was something that I wish that I could go back and do a bit. I probably would have taken a couple more other courses to get a little bit more variety. But I really was able to supplement that with just the interest in reading different things. And so it's tough to, I don't know that I would go back and do it over, but if I was sitting down with someone, I'd say take courses that are diverse and don't buy into the demand that people are placing on you that you specialize as an 18-year-old. I've heard that now. I've been practicing law for 12 years, and from day one, I've heard specialize. And as I get in my practice, and my practice is a general corporate counsel role, the more diverse, the more liberal arts approach I take to my job, the more breadth and depth I can bring, because I serve more as a quarterback than as a specialist. And so I know where to go find answers. I know where to go find people. I know how to solve problems and situations that I wouldn't if I was very narrow in my focus. And so if you choose to be a history major, one of the choices that you're making is you're choosing, in some part, to be a generalist. And so embrace that. Rather than view that as something that's a negative, embrace it for what it is and become very broad in your skills, abilities, interests, and you'll relate to people better. I think that's probably one thing I would tell a student. Another one is, your folks might say, what can you do with a history major? The reality is, what I've seen over and over is some of the very best, the most talented people I see in business are people that came out of liberal arts backgrounds. They didn't walk out and have their job ready in hand. And so that's one of the downsides is it is very competitive up front. But the difference is you will learn how to do your jobs, and it also force you to broaden your horizons a bit to take into account all the different pieces. So it's not, you don't get your ticket punched when you have a history major. We all know that. There's no surprise. And for me, that's why law school made sense. At the same point, I think 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, how it serves you and your ability to learn, the ability to deal with people is invaluable. And lots of people I see in leadership positions have that ability and not just a singular focus in one specific discipline.
I looked for an internship just to kind of give me some more views of like different areas and aspects of museums, and just even looking at living history versus like the Minnesota Historical Society, and seeing just if there was an area that I could find my niche in, or just things I was passionate about that I didn't realize. And so I ended up working with Item Homestead, which is a living history museum. It's set on a farm between 1890 and 1910, which I chose that one. There were very few various ones. I could be working with an archives at the downtown Central Library and their special collections, but this one just was more appealing just because it was something I hadn't encountered, and I thought it was good to explore that a bit too. I loved the staff, and so getting ready for our Spring on the Farm event was just really fun, even though just planning everything from the Doug Omen photo presentation of his historic historic barns, but also just planting like flowers and planting herbs for the kids, and just very tangible physical tasks I was given. I really liked that, and having deadlines and meeting those, but just getting to work on that with the staff there was really enjoyable.
So if I haven't mentioned it yet in this course, probably a pretty important part of my story is that I grew up in the Evangelical Covenant Church. The Covenant, if you don't know it, is a pretty small denomination. Historically, Swedish immigrants like my great-great-grandfather Peterson, who joined Covenant churches in western Wisconsin. So that was my mom's background, and it's what I grew up in places like Cottage Grove, Mendota Heights, and then when we came to Stillwater. Now, by the time I got to Stillwater in the 1980s, the Covenant Church had moved out to another side of town in a more modern building. But for a long time, the building behind me was the Covenant Church. In fact, it was founded in 1881, 4 years before there was even a Covenant denomination. So it's one of the oldest Covenant churches in the country and in the state of Minnesota, to be sure. This building is from 1904, when they had grown to the point where they needed a bigger space. And it's just a really striking piece of architecture. Part of me wishes that that was the church I had grown up in. It's from a kind of common style from around the time called the Akron Plan, and the architect was actually the pastor of the church. It's meant to evoke opera house, which might seem like a kind of strange concept for the sort of pietistic, revivalistic evangelical Swedes, but there's a kind of grandeur to it, and especially if you went inside. Now, unfortunately, if you were to go inside, you wouldn't really see church, you would see Catholic bookstore. This is now Loom's Bookstore, which is a really great used bookstore, but this hasn't been a church since the 1970s. So I'm glad it's been preserved in this form, and I still like going there just for the books, but it reminds me of kind of a different era in my denomination, my church's history. Let's continue now our conversation about biography and history.
Okay, so Amy, when we started this conversation, you talked about a story of a couple of women who moved to Colorado and how it helps you understand women's history, history of the Southwest. I don't know if you use some of these stories for your environmental history class. Can you talk a little bit about the role the biographies play in teaching, or maybe in the work you do with research?
Yes. So from the teaching perspective, I think that biography is something I find that students, not all, but that there's a segment of my sort of student population that just really connects with the personal. And so I think that biography and memoir are really useful teaching tools to say, especially for me, because I think as a religious historian or looking at religious practice, especially when it's one that you're not familiar with, when it's outside of your own. I had a student who once was talking about a particular autobiography, I guess you could call it, that we read, a memoir, really, of a man named Eboo Patel, who's a Pakistani Indian American Muslim. And the student's comment was, I feel like I totally understood kind of, the history and theology pieces, but I didn't understand the heart of the people who practice Islam until he read this particular book. So I think that the memoir and the biography do an excellent job of getting at our hearts, especially when we recognize that maybe we've kept that, we may have had an open mind, but we've kept our heart closed sometimes to when we're learning something new or we feel like it might be threatening. So particularly in my classes that focus on Islam, I would say that memoir is the main way for me to be able to present a picture of Islam that is living and real and emotional and personal. So in my own work, in my own research, I do quite a bit of work with interviewing, and I love, I love stories. I love to hear other people's stories. That's what's always sort of motivated me as a historian, and why I think it's important and why I think that it's valuable. And so that's incredibly enriching work. It is difficult work. It's draining work because it's you have to have, I think, a different type of focus. You have to learn something I've learned about, which is the tools of phenomenology, which is that as people are speaking, you have to be paying as much attention to their voice inflection and their emotion when they're saying things, and the way that they're acting, as well as listening to them and to the actual words that they're saying. I think one of the greatest challenges, though, of using biography or using individual stories in your own academic work is that I found that what happens when the stories I'm hearing aren't telling the story I thought they were going to tell, right? So you choose specific people because of demographic information, and you have, as any researcher does, a thesis or a hypothesis about what's going to come out of those conversations, and then you re-listen to the conversations, and you are doing your transcription, and you realize the story they're telling is completely different. So I know for me, my own dissertation work, the thrust of my dissertation completely had to change based on the stories that I was hearing. And you have to be true. You have to let them speak. So no matter how much extra work it's going to cost for you.
Well, I think it suggests what to me is really an interesting theme of this whole discussion is it helps us think about who owns history, right? So like a biography that I use in my Modern Europe class is called Mrs. Robinson's Disgrace by Kate Summerscale. And it's based on a diary of a middle-class Victorian housewife named Isabel Robinson who has this scandalous divorce trial because maybe she had an affair, maybe she didn't. But essentially, the story is reconstructed on the basis of her diary. So in a sense, you've got not quite a memoir. It's a more immediate thing. But one of the themes of the book is how do we know that that's true? You know, and so on one level, Isabella controls her own life, and she's trying to shape how it's remembered. And Summerscale even argues she means this diary to be discovered. She's writing this to an audience, and we are now that audience. And so it becomes useful, and it helps us connect with the heart of someone who otherwise you probably wouldn't hear their voice in that society. But Summerscale also pushes back and suggests, well, but you're being manipulated by it. Someone's trying to control their identity. And so it makes me think, though, about the work you do with, say, oral history. You know, this is not purely like, it's not just a pure power over relationship. It's not like... there's a negotiation there, there's a conversation there, they can challenge your preconceptions. There might be points where there's actually conflict.
There's points where you might write something that somebody said, you have the transcription of them saying it, and they'll say to you, I don't like that I said that. Well, they don't like that they said it, but they did say it. So how do you balance? I mean, I've done one oral interview where basically I had to throw it out because the person upon seeing it was not happy about the message they felt that what they were saying was sending, didn't want it included. So you have to take that voice out. So now what do you do where that clearly reveals that something was really important? From the historians, you know, the investigative piece, it's sort of, well, gosh, we've stumbled upon something. So how do I make sure that this particular issue or this idea is now represented in the story I'm telling, but the person who brought it up is saying, I don't want anything to do with it anymore.
And you're in an unusual spot where you're actually interacting with people who are alive and can say these things to you. I think many of us, when we're doing our work, we're writing about people who are dead. And so a challenge I sometimes give to students is, what does it mean to have that kind of power over these stories? I mean, and how do you treat people with integrity and respect and charity, but also, you know, what happens when a biography of Hitler and Stalin, and, you know, they would certainly like to tell the story one way, but as a historian, you have a responsibility to the truth.
Yes, and I think that, I mean, something that one of my professors from graduate school would always say, would sort of say with fist pounding, the text has rights, give the text its rights, you know, and I think that's something I always try to remember. You have to do the work, which is something I've learned. I don't think I'm perfect at it, but I feel like I'm growing, and you have to corroborate evidence. So that's a big piece of it too, is what is this person saying, but then what is the work of the historian to go and to say what other pieces of evidence that we have to help us either support, challenge, or you know, or at least help us think more deeply about whatever this person is saying. And so I think that is something that I feel like the individual story is such a wonderful, well, it can be either. It can either be a starting point. For me, it's kind of been a starting point. Or it can be, you know, I think it functions in different capacities depending upon the project that you're doing.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our time. I declare you the winner of this conversation.
Oh, wow.
Will you have
Thanks.
a rematch with me sometime?
Sure.
Okay. Thanks, Amy Poppinga.
We'll end our tour of Stillwater in probably one of the nicer places, down by the St. Croix River. You see the very famous kind of iconic image of the Stillwater Lift Bridge. This is from the 1930s. Probably won't be here too much longer. There's been a long percolating process to get a new bridge because this one is structurally deficient, but people still drive on it. We're in downtown Stillwater. If you actually go right up this street, this is Myrtle right here. If you go to Myrtle in Maine, in some ways that's where the state of Minnesota was born. In 1848, there was a shop and they had the first territorial convention. Next year, Congress created the territory of Minnesota. So that's the source of Stillwater's maybe optimistic claim that's the birthplace of Minnesota. The upshot of that is that while Minneapolis got the University of Minnesota, St. Paul got the state capital, Stillwater was given the honor of hosting the territory's prison. We will not be shooting at the prison today in our tour of Stillwater. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Past and Presents. We'll be back next week with another episode.
Back, baby, back in time. Wanna go back when you were mine. Back, baby, back in time.